In the summer of 1914, a single gunshot in Sarajevo shattered a century of relative peace. Within weeks, 6 million men marched toward the frontiers, as the major powers of Europe activated a web of treaties they could no longer control. This map shows how the continent was divided. You have the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, aligned by a mutual suspicion of Germany. Facing them is the Triple Alliance, Germany, Italy, and the fragile empire of Austria-Hungary. The target of that initial shot was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was killed by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old nationalist seeking to liberate Slav territories from imperial rule. Austria-Hungary used the killing to justify an invasion of Serbia, but because the Russian Tsar felt honor-bound to defend his fellow Slavs, he ordered his army to mobilize. Germany, promising total support to Austria, viewed Russian mobilization as an act of war and began moving its own troops. Because of how these alliances were structured, a localized conflict in the Balkans made a wider continental war a certainty. No leader could back down without leaving their allies exposed, turning a single assassination into a general European conflagration. Across the continent, millions of men enthusiastically joined the colors. They marched through their capitals to the cheers of crowds, convinced the fighting would be over before the leaves fell. Germany's strategy for a quick victory was the Schlieffen Plan. As this map shows, they intended to avoid a slow war on two fronts by sweeping through neutral Belgium to encircle the French armies near Paris, knocking France out of the fight before Russia could even finish mobilizing its forces in the east. But the German advance was halted just 40 miles from Paris at the River Marne. As both sides tried to find an open flank, they raced northward, eventually stretching their lines all the way to the coast. With no open ground left to maneuver, the armies began to dig. They carved a continuous line of earthworks from the English Channel to the Swiss border, creating a 350-mile front that would barely move for the next 3 years. The war settled into a grueling stalemate. Millions of men were forced into a life of freezing mud and stagnant water, living under the constant threat of disease and random artillery strikes. As the land war stalled, the conflict moved to the sea. Britain used its naval superiority to blockade Germany's ports, aiming to starve their economy into submission. Germany retaliated with U-boats, submarines that could strike undetected from beneath the waves. In 1915, a German torpedo sank the Lusitania, a British passenger liner. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans, shifting public opinion in the United States and creating a major diplomatic crisis for Berlin. On the Western Front, both sides turned to increasingly horrific technology to break the deadlock. The introduction of poison gas added a new, chemical dimension to the slaughter, forcing every soldier to carry a respirator just to survive the air they breathed. The British developed the first mechanized tanks, heavy, armored boxes designed to roll over trenches and crush the barbed wire that made infantry charges so suicidal. These innovations turned the war into an industrialized process. Human lives became another resource to be consumed by a global machine, prioritizing output over survival. By 1916, victory was no longer defined by capturing territory, but by attrition. The goal was to bleed the enemy's manpower and resources dry until their entire society collapsed from the sheer weight of the losses. This strategy transformed the landscape into a lunar wasteland. At battles like Verdun, nearly 1 million men were killed or wounded as both sides poured artillery shells into a few square miles of mud. This chart shows the reality of that strategy. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, waves of British troops were sent against fortified German lines. In just a few hours, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties. The scale of the war reached far beyond the trenches of France. It consumed the mountains of the Caucasus, the beaches of Gallipoli, and the vast colonial territories of Africa in the Middle East. By the end of 1916, this strategy of attrition had brought no one closer to victory. Instead, it had exhausted the world's major empires, pushing their economies and civilian populations toward a breaking point. In Russia, the pressure finally caused a total internal collapse. Chronic food shortages and millions of battlefield casualties triggered a revolution that overthrew the Tsar and eventually pulled Russia out of the war entirely. Russia's exit allowed Germany to shift 500,000 battle-hardened troops to the Western Front. For a brief moment, the German High Command had the numerical superiority they needed to potentially win the war. But that window was closing. British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, which revealed a German plan to draw Mexico into a war against the United States. This, along with renewed submarine attacks, finally brought the U.S. into the conflict. The Americans brought immense industrial capacity and a massive pool of fresh manpower. 10,000 new soldiers were arriving in France every day, providing a surge of energy to the exhausted Allied armies. Berlin was running out of time. They had to achieve a total military breakthrough in the West before the American mobilization reached its full strength, or the combined weight of Allied resources would make a German defeat inevitable. Germany launched a final, desperate offensive in the spring of 1918, but the advance stalled. The Allies, now reinforced by American divisions and hundreds of tanks, launched a counterattack that finally broke the German defensive lines. As the front lines collapsed, the German home front followed. The British naval blockade had caused widespread starvation, and by late 1918, the German Navy was in open mutiny, while civilian strikes paralyzed the nation's war industry. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated his throne and fled to the Netherlands. On November 11, 1918, a new German government signed an armistice, ending 4 years of slaughter. The Paris Peace Conference redrew the world map, creating new nations from the ruins of old empires. However, the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept total blame for the war and pay massive financial reparations, leaving the country humiliated and economically broken. The final tally was staggering. 9.5 million soldiers were dead, and another 7 million civilians had perished from starvation, disease, and the violence of a war that had touched every corner of the globe. The Great War changed the world forever, but it did not bring lasting stability. The punitive terms of the peace and the economic ruin of the losers left behind a legacy of bitterness, ensuring that the roots of the next global catastrophe were already being planted.